All right, this video is going to be fairly straightforward, and we're asking what seems like a pretty simple question, but it's more complicated than you would think. The question is, when a tissue gets damaged and needs to repair itself, how do the cells in that tissue know that they need to do the repairing to begin with? All right, so in our example, we're going to talk about damage to the skin, but the same concept works in other tissues as well. So pretend that you had some sort of cut, scrape, puncture wound, doesn't really matter what it is, and we get damage of the epidermis, right? In this case, the damage also extends down into the dermis. And what I want you to think about is these cells in the epidermis, they're used to dividing and migrating up at all times, right? Cells at the top are dying and falling off, and their job is just to divide and move up to replace the ones that are gone now. The difference is when we have an injury, we need those cells to somehow change their mind and start dividing side to side instead of going up. And to put it bluntly, cells are stupid. They don't have an intelligence. There's not like a little man in the cell that sees, hey, there's a cut, we need to fix it. And so there has to be some kind of molecular mechanism that can tell these cells, all right, we need to start dividing faster. Instead of moving up, we need to go side to side, and we need to do it until we connect to each other again and fill in the gap where that tissue is damaged. So along the way, you get inflammation from the immune system that triggers increased blood flow, bringing nutrients to the area. You start blood clotting to prevent more blood from leaking out. You build up this, granulation, which is really just connective tissue that tries to put a more permanent stop to the blood loss. And eventually you'll wind up with a scar. But all of those processes involve cells dividing. And so the question that I want to ask is, how do epithelial cells know when to migrate and when to stop? And not just migration, there's going to be cell division involved here too. And the idea is, if you remember back to the video where we covered intracellular junctions, these cells are physically connected to each other, right, with protein junctions like tight junctions and gap junctions and desmosomes that link their membranes to each other. The cool part is those connections between cell membranes are not just like, nuts and bolts that hold cells together. They can also act like receptors, all right? And so these cells know when they're tightly packed together because it activates receptors when their membranes make physical contact, right? And so this term contact inhibition, we say that contact inhibits migration and cell division for that matter, right? So if cells are touching each other on all four sides, they won't divide anymore, right? If they lose contact, right, so when there's damage, imagine that these cells are on the border of where the scrape or the cut was. When those cells get peeled away during the injury, this side of all of these cells is no longer making contact. So at that point, you're removing contact inhibition, right? That makes a double negative. If you're removing the inhibition, that really means that you're stimulating, right, cell division and migration. And the point is, we want those cells to start dividing and moving to fill the gap. And they're going to do that until they make contact, right? So if you do this experiment where you take cells like fibroblasts out of a skin sample, let's say, from a living person or an animal, and you spread them apart on a plastic dish, and you put them in some growth medium, and you watch them under your microscope, they'll divide and spread over the course of several days until the cells have divided so much that they make contact on all sides. Normal healthy cells will just completely stop dividing because they have contact inhibition kick in. This is absolutely critical for preventing cancer because cancer, like a tumor, is just uncontrolled cell growth. And so mutations that cause cells to lose contact inhibition is one of the hallmarks of cancer, right? If cells had contact inhibition, tumors would go nowhere because as soon as they started dividing and multiplying, contact inhibition would kick in, the tumor would regulate itself, and it would just not grow anymore, and you'd probably never notice it, right? And so there are many other mutations that have to pop up for cancer to become a thing, but that's one of them. Okay, so while we're on that topic, really quick overview of skin cancer. Remember, cancer of any kind is just the result of cells that lose the ability to control how fast they divide. And as an example of how cancer is not uniform, there are 3 different major categories of skin cancer that can develop. You can get basal cell carcinoma, which is cell division of cells in the stratum basal. You can get squamous cell carcinoma, which is division of keratinocytes after they leave the stratum basal. And you can get melanoma, which is division of melanocytes. Right? And so when someone says, it'd be nice if we had a cure for cancer, it's not really a realistic idea because there's no such thing as just cancer. Even within each of these subtypes, there are even more subtypes based on exactly what mutations that person happened to develop. And so as an interesting example of this, it links these ideas back to the concept of adaptation. The question that this paper was proposing is, does sunscreen prevent melanoma? And the answer seems to be, it's not exactly clear. It's very clear that sunscreen prevents basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma because those cells are very exposed to UV light. Melanoma, remember, melanocytes are making melanin. It's pigmented. Those cells basically have built-in protection, so they're not as affected by UV light as other cell types are. And so we're not going to dive into all the details, but the conclusion seems to be sunscreen really isn't very good at preventing melanoma because it's likely caused by something other than UV light. But it is good at preventing cancer in those two cell types because they are exposed to more UV radiation. And so as you move through whatever career in science and medicine you're working towards, remember, the answers to scientific questions are often much more complicated than they seem. So when you ask, does sunscreen prevent skin cancer? The answer is, yeah, sometimes for some forms, but not so much for others. Right? And that's why these questions are so very difficult to deal with. And that's why we try to understand the complexities of physiology and avoid generalizing questions like that. Okay. All right. Hope you found this interesting. This is the last video in our section on skin. And make sure you follow the channel, watch the videos in order. It'll make more sense that way. And subscribe to it so in case anything new pops up, they come your way.